Hello everyone. So welcome to the next lecture of this course. What we were looking in the last lecture was the willingness, or what should we call as a political willingness. Now we move from technology to political willingness, challenges in that, and what we also looked at in that was that how word is a fragmented place with respect to the whole narrative, whole thought process. There's a whole theory behind the whole transition, which is challenging this transition in a swift manner, which is a debate between the developed and the developing nation. Now, there is one more angle to the whole thing, which has to be the enabler of the whole transition, which is to be the finance. And because when we were talking about the technology aspects also, or when we were talking about the willingness from the word political leaders also, or word political entities also, was that whole background of it was that how will the money come for all of this transition? How the financing of this will happen, and what would be the financial architecture of all this transition could be. So, I will not be talking specifically in terms of financing in this lecture, but overall the financial architecture, how the world is looking from a financial architecture as a support system to this transition, and is it really working as a support, or is it really working as a deterrent somewhere? Let us see, and then in next couple of lectures that is what we will look into. So, we have talked about that international climate arrangement has emerged from negotiation processes that reflects conflict of interest, distribution concerns. There is a whole debate of who gets what responsibility it is of whose, and behind this there is a whole issue of fairness between the developed and the developing nation. And now, as I said, that I will be now moving to a thing that how climate commitments translate into real investment and measurable emission reduction, and how finance or financial architecture is becoming the whole background of all of this, right. So, climate finance actually is a system. It is not just about financing this transition only, right. Financing this transition is only a partial part of the whole narrative. It is sometimes it is discussed in a very partial manner, that we discuss about carbon markets, we discuss about climate funds, we talk about green bonds, but that is a very narrow way of looking in the whole thing. But because this is not sufficient, because what you need to understand is that there is a whole economics which works in the background of it. It is not only about funding that transition, it is about that who will be the buyer, it is about who wants to buy it and why they want to buy it, and what will be the cross-border mechanism to kind of support this, right. So, this has to be really looked into from a holistic perspective, where we have to look from a market-based instruments, that what kind of instruments in the market can work towards this transition. What will it be supported by public financing institutions, or new bodies has to be created around this thing? What will be the regulatory and trade mechanism also? This is a very important aspect of this whole transition is, right, because we cannot just let the market finance forces take the control of this whole dynamics, because are they being done in the right way? Are they being done in a way where we are avoiding greenwashing? You would have heard this term all along, right. So, is this whole narrative being done in a fair manner? So, with this, that's kind of a background that we need to kind of work upon, and these background, these mechanisms needs to work hand in hand. None of them can work in isolation, right. A regulator needs to then regulate that how a specific instrument is being done rightfully, and that then instrument learning has to go and feed into the regulations upgradation in terms of that how that regulation should be upgraded depending upon how the market is accepting, or is it becoming a kind of enabler for the market, or is it becoming a deterrent for the market, right. So, therefore, basically what we need to kind of understand is that we need to understand climate finance as a system. It is basically a system level design problem rather than working in form of isolated tools, and that is how we should kind of look into the whole thing. So, all of this kind of started, and so while there were talks about in fragments before that also, but if you look at rightfully, this all started with Paris Agreement. In Paris Agreement, this is the first time a kind of a global framework was created in terms of that how this coordination of the climate action across countries will take place. And it was first time discussed that what could be some such mechanism that which could enable the whole thing. But it does not give a centralized implementation plan, of course, because as you will understand, the COP body is not a regulatory body. It can only suggest framework. But nonetheless, it suggested a framework, and it talked about various articles under that, where namely the Article 4, which talk about national determined contributions, which NDCs, how much which country will take a target on reducing how much carbon. It talked about Article 9, which was climate finance, which involved financial supports from developed nation to developing nation. You remember I talked about a kind of a value of about $100 billion on an annual basis being funded from developed nation to developing nation to this transition. This all kind of discussion started with Paris Agreement itself. Then there was a whole issue of Article 10, which was talk about technology transfer, because that was a big concern from these developing nations or the nations which are not so technically savvy in terms of that how will they get the right technologies to transition. It also talked about Article 11, which was about capacity building. It talked about Article 13, about transparency and reporting mechanisms. So all the articles kind of talked about everything in kind of a trying to paint the whole picture from end to end. And these basically to support implementation, right? And this was a thought process that these articles, if they are kind of followed rightfully, they will be supporting this kind of implementation. But as we all know today, what has happened is that rather that they have kind of worked in isolation. They have really worked not as a coherent force together, because one arm has not talked to other arms so forcefully. And so this has really remained as a parallel component rather than an integrated financial system. That has been the unfortunate fact of the whole transition. But nonetheless, this attempt was done in the Paris Agreement to handle this issue. Then if you kind of try to look at the whole picture from a macro aspect, so we were talking about mitigation, we were talking about adaptation, and we talk about the finance flows around this. This was all discussed under Article 2. From that mitigation, it kind of flowed into Article 4 in terms of setting up the mitigation goals. From adaptation, it flowed into Article 7 in terms of setting up the adaptation goals. And from financial flows, it talks about that loss and damage funds. And then along with that, from an objective perspective, more articles were kind of set up at that point, that we were talking about Article 5, which talks about maintaining the sinks. Article 9, as I already talked about, was about how will this be financed. I talked about Article 10, I talked about Article 11 already. And from there, then what will be the means to adopt to these changes in terms of purpose, objective, and what will be the means. And from the means perspective, it was that how much are we actually emitting. That was done under Article 14 in terms of stock taking. Then Article 3 talked about NDCs, which talked about that what kind of targets that can we take, and then depending upon how are we emitting and what kind of targets that we are taking, that was feeding back into objectives and kind of setting up these targets back on a 5 years basis. It was determined that every 5 years stock taking would be done, and every 5 years this NDCs will be kind of reviewed in terms of our target and achievement, and they will kind of feed back into the objectives in terms of that so that these objectives should not be static objectives, and they should be always looked from a dynamic perspective from that side. From the means, that there was also transparency. I talked about this regulatory bodies formation, and then there was public engagement, which was done through Article 12. Now, while we were talking about all of this, a big theme which was very well identified during the Paris Agreement was that countries cannot go towards this path of carbon mitigation if they continue to work in isolation. Now, one, we all understand that carbon is a global problem. We very well understand that. But on top of it, there will be countries who would need to reduce more carbon. There will be countries who will not be emitting so much of carbon then, but whatever carbon they need to reduce, they may not have the means and measures to do that. Now, how do we make a structure where the money fund can flow from one entity to another entity? So there could be one entity who's looking to reduce it. So entity 1 is looking to reduce its carbon. Entity 2 is sitting on some positive carbon, for example, Bhutan for now. And they can do away by even giving out some carbon also. So a trade mechanism was kind of set up between these two countries, and this is how it was kind of a structure was formed around this thing, that this whole flow of business between the two entities, actually the carbon flow between these two entities could actually be converted into a business flow. And that business flow will be funded or will be not funded is not the right word, but a money transition can a structure should be placed around that thing. And then how this whole business and kind of will be set up between these two entities, or these two kind of a seeker and a giver. So there were two entities which was very clearly identified in this whole game, that on one hand there is an entity which is a seeker. It could be a country like I mentioned, or it could sometimes be a company also. And how will that kind of the person who is looking to seek this carbon, because there could be targets around this, because then you have gone into NDCs. From NDCs, some of the countries kind of went into establishing the firm carbon targets. Once the carbon targets has been set up, those carbon targets will trickle down to specific entities to adhere to this. when those entities are trying to adhere to it, they may have to have technology and financial means to reduce the carbon footprint of their entity. We talked about this from a technology perspective a lot, in terms of be it be hydrogen the technology, be it be carbon sequestration, or be it be as simple as moving to renewable energies also. Whatever you need to do, you will need to do something to reduce your carbon. Now, you may have the financial means to do that, but sometimes you may not have the physical means of doing it, like the space might not be available with you. Sometimes you may not have the right manpower or workforce to kind of handle this thing. You may also not have the right kind of tools at times also. So it could go both ways. Sometimes your technology might not be available. So it could work both ways. Now, how do this? So that's where the Article 6 was kind of set up. That under Article 6, a corporation mechanism was set up, and under that, three major things that I like. So I will be majorly talking about 6.2 and 6.4, but there were multiple sub-articles which are formed. Then under Article 6.2, a cooperative implementation or a bilateral agreement framework was formed. And maybe one or two lectures later from now, I'll be talking about something interesting which India and Japan has done recently on this. Then there was a Paris Agreement Crediting System, or PACM, which was kind of established at that time, which was talked about how can this be converted into some form of a money which could also be exchanged or traded. And then there was non-market mechanism which was kind of established. But so overall, a kind of a structure was tried to be given. But as you can understand, that these are again multiple pillars, but no defined financial flow mechanism was established at the time, and it was left to the market to kind of determine that how the market will take it up in terms of all of this financial flow. So before I go forward, I would like to leave you with a certain thought process here. Like, now, what is the underlying assumption here? The underlying assumption here is that there are well equipped, like financially more powerful institutions which are looking to reduce their carbon footprint, and in turn they can go and do a trade agreement or do a bilateral agreement with another entity which is less resourceful, or does not have the right financial muscles to kind of handle their own transition. So you're kind of going and asking the other entity to kind of their carbon to the entity which is having more resources, and that entity would in turn give the first entity some kind of a financial means to compensate for the whatever carbon they have been given. But then if you look at it deeper, is it not disabling the second entity to actually reach to a situation of carbon neutrality or net zero carbon? Because in a way, whatever carbon they will be saving in future also, they might have a pre-sold those carbons to the first the other entity already, right? So if you start looking at from a geographical level perspective, now you convert this debate into developed nation versus developing nation debate. Now I'm taking back you to the political debate. As soon as you do that, so now you are basically what you are saying is that developed nation has lack of space, like a lot of Europe doesn't have the right space to put in the renewable energy. Now they are working a lot on wind side. And then there is a whole thing of developing nation which doesn't have the resources to move towards their carbon mitigation pathways. So what was kind of established was that these developed nation can buy carbon from developing nations in terms of some projects which would be more carbon positive. So there could be green fields which could be available, there could be some other means, so it could be in form of buying some forest area like in Africa or some other areas, or some other green means. Like recently a lot of news on this was created around, I think one of the Indian states, that was Karnataka or Tamil Nadu, where it was said that a lot of farmers made a tie-up with a big corporate to sell their carbon credits to that specific entity and to help that entity become carbon neutral. Now that, what looking from a country perspective, now these developing nations are selling their carbon to developed nation. In turn, they are getting either the money or they are getting tech. Now, is that leading to a situation that in future these developing nations will not be able to meet and reach carbon neutrality on their own, because they would have already sold their carbon which they could afford, which they could have potentially used in future to mitigate their own carbon footprint in future. Now, is that not a possibility? And I'll just leave you with that thought, because I don't think anybody is, I'm pretty sure people are aware of it, but nobody is talking openly about it, that the kind of trade agreements that we are seeing these days, the kind of pushback from Europe or some Western world is coming to some of these developing nations to do the business in a certain way and do the carbon trading in a certain way, that is being forced. And in a way, these developing nations are giving their carbons to these developed nations in the need of money or in the need of technology. is that not disabling them for future carbon neutrality? Just leaving you with this thought, or their path will not become tougher and tougher, and that can really well happen. I may touch upon this point as we kind of go along with this lecture further, right? So anyway, taking it further, so under Article 6, this cooperative approach to mitigation was kind of formulated, and Article 6 introduced the possibility of voluntary cooperation between two countries in achieving their emission reduction target. I think I've talked about it already. Like, one is a giver, another one is a seeker, and this means that countries are not only restricted to their domestic mitigation action, but they can really go international to kind of formulate this path. And this could also would mean that a country may finance the emission reduction activities in another country, and in count, like, so the resulting reduction could actually be counted with its own targets, and so that is where the whole game is. Then so that is where it is kind of said that on one way it gives you that flexibility. In one way, it enables the country which doesn't have enough resources to have those flexibility, to have that means to reach towards carbon neutrality. Otherwise, they will not be able to do it in another way. So just looking at deeper into carbon Article 6, so there could be multiple kind of sub articles which was kind of formed around this. That there was a whole Article 6.2 which I already talked about, that under that it involved internationally transferable mitigation outcomes, ITMOs they are called, and which has to be consistent with the CMA guidelines. So CMA is nothing but a convention of parties serving as meeting of parties to the Paris Agreement. So under that, the framework was created. So CMA created these guidelines. Under that, this ITMOs what could be exchanged. These ITMOs could actually be used by to meet NDCs by the party who are kind of is paying for them. They could meet their NDCs buying out these ITMOs, and this the other entity which is giving out the ITMOs can earn some revenue through that mechanism. So this also kind of set up the basis for carbon pricing, or maybe just then what will the cost of these ITMOs will be, and that is something which was kind of like left to the market forces to kind of determine this cost, and this kind of forms the basis of carbon pricing, because then the less available these ITMOs are, or less available these carbon credits are, the more expensive they would be, and that's what the market kind of worked towards. That market expected that this thing will take its own shape, and that's where the emission traded fund ETFs kind of came into picture. So we will talk about that also going forward. So from that, the Article 6.4 kind of worked out, where it was said that kind of a mechanism was set up where a designated body or a supervisory body was done. It also monitored that there was avoided the double use of 6.4 emission reduction towards NDCs, and that was one of the major tasks that this regulatory body was supposed to do. It also used the share of proceeds for administrative expenses and adaptation, and then overall it kind of created this mandate for CMA, or it kind of worked from under the mandate of CMA to create these rules, modalities and procedure. That's how it was done. And for the non-market approach, it was done that there could be a non-market approach also, and these non-market approach would basically lead to sustainable development. It would lead in from a project to project kind of a working, where it will be more kind of a resource sharing or some other means through which it will be done. But so that was another thing which potentially could be done around that area. And what was the economic logic behind this cooperation was pretty simple, because as remember MAC curve, when we talk about MAC curve, initially the countries or the entities would have certain mitigation potential or possibilities through which you can have the carbon mitigation possibilities through lower money induction. But as kind of you move towards the right hand side of your trajectory, and you as you start to move towards your NDC goals, the kind of money which will be need to be inducted into a system will be much more than what you otherwise would need to do at a initial phase of the project. And some other entity would be there who would be having more resources, like for example India. India has so much of renewable energy potential. Now with India's renewable energy potential, India can potentially generate more renewable energy than it would need to consume on its own. Then can it create a renewable energy kind of a bank, which can then be converted into giving out the green energy to some other entity who is struggling to meet its requirement for green energy. So that is one with giving it very simply, but there could be much more complicated models around it, like creating of greenland, creating of jungles around it. Like in Africa, a lot of such projects are kind of coming up these days. So each country will have its own emission target. Each country will have its own resources to do that. and some countries might be, or some entities might be sitting on a more resources than they actually would need to do their path of mitigation. And then the kind of on the other hand, there is another entity who is struggling to meet its carbon target, so they can go and buy these carbon credits from the other entity. And that's a kind of a economic concept which was kind of framed, and a kind of a mechanism was created all around this to kind of have this easy flow of kind of money in form of business flow of money from point to point, right? So on that, what was basically kind of worked was that these ITMOs was this kind of came as an output of Article 6.2, and it was talked about that when these articles kind of came around, what was expected was that the countries will start trading most of their carbon through these routes, at least between the countries wherever the voluntary information can come. And slowly it was thought through that more and more carbon will be kind of traded through these means much more. This was established in 2005, like European ETF kind of came around in 2005. It started to give some kind of a trade value to these ITMOs in from a carbon market perspective. But initially, it took some time for the market to kind of understand whole of this mechanism is working. But slowly, what we are seeing is that from about 5% of the market in 2005, which was being traded through this route, back in 2025, almost 28% of global emission is covered by a direct carbon prices. So that's kind of a change which world is moving towards. I may talk to you about some numbers on this carbon pricing. That carbon prices has not moved to the value that world was expecting them to move, but nonetheless, it is more and more carbon is now being traded through this route. And so there are about 80 emissions trading systems and carbon taxes implementation which is going globally. Like back to back 2 years, World Bank has reported that about 100 billion of revenue was raised in 2 consecutive years through these means. And so overall, like this market is really growing. And what is happening is that the whole exchange of carbon is now not happening at a notional level, but through a regulated, monitored, funded or fundable mechanism through which this carbon can actually be priced rightly and could actually be exchanged between the two entities. However, as I said that the carbon credit prices have been lower than what was expected to happen. But on the other hand, since the prices are low, so more and more entities are also willing to buy them also. So remember, what will determine the cost of these carbon credits? It will determine that in your MAC curve, where are you sitting? Do you still have the possibilities of having cheaper means of mitigating your carbon through some means which will be lower than this carbon credit prices? And I think world has still not reached a stage where still world is struggling with these kind of norms. But I think that slowly it will reach to a point where it will be struggling to have its carbon footprint rightly handled other way. So world would have to kind of have higher and higher carbon prices if they don't start mitigating fast enough. So these carbon credits works as a financial assistant because then these ITMOs when they were exchanged, they can work like financial assets. So in this 2005, when this kind of exchange was set up, it was anticipated these carbon credits will in a way work as financial assets. They will start working in a way that somebody who is kind of earning more and more carbon credits can then keep them as a bank and can trade later on when these carbon prices will kind of go up. And so these values will depend upon multiple factors. That it will depend upon that how much of emission was reduced. So it will also depend upon a verification process. How much is the demand of those carbon credit? As I've been telling you again and again that it will be done by demand. Remember, these NDCs are not legally binding targets for many of the geographies still. These are still voluntary. Since they are still voluntary, so can these be tailored or can they be kind of managed on the way? Or countries can say that, okay, we did not meet it, we don't need to spend that much of money on buying the carbon credits also. So that's also a possibility. But nonetheless, so it will all depend this carbon pricing will depend upon a lot of other mechanisms. And so overall, but at least attempt was made to create a framework through which this carbon can actually be converted into money aspect. Remember what has happened globally. Globally, so far, we have been able to do the manufacturing without worrying about that how much are we harming the atmosphere. There was no penalty. There was no kind of a price mechanism which was set up that how much are you emitting while you are producing. And since we did not have that mechanism which was set up, so everybody could make the cheapest way for them. Now, if that cheapest way is harming the environment, so be it, right? And now Since that should not have been the case, now a world is trying to set up a system where at least more benefits should be given for clean manufacturers, and the so-called non-clean manufacturers or manufacturers which still depend upon so much of fossil fuel should be reprimanded in certain way by giving them this penalty of this carbon pricing, or this giving them disadvantage on this carbon trading mechanism. And this is how this whole thing is being set up. So what is being done is that people who are actually doing this carbon mitigation should be able to create these assets which they could utilize in future for their benefit. So I've already talked about this stuff, so I should not be going about this and again, but just to kind of tell you that there is almost 3 times more domestic compliance in 2024 compared to 2023. So this market is moving in the right direction, and so let us hope that we will continue to move the way we should be. Then the second thing under this, then Article 6.4, then once this carbon under ITMOs, this carbon credits has been created, then under Article 6.4 they could be exchanged, they could be through a regulatory mechanism, they could be exchanged or traded. And for that UNFCCC, like Article 6.4 supervision body was created, and for this the credit was issued. They were authorized by the host party, and then they would be given and to the buyer party, or the buyer entity kind of took it, and from that buyer party then in return a financial or a technical support was given to the party one. And that's how this kind of whole kind of a system is kind of established to work around that, right? So this is a thing which was kind of worked out in a certain manner, but as you can understand that this has not worked the way it should, otherwise the carbon prices should have been somewhere else, right? Because while they were designed to improve the efficiency of carbon reduction across entities or across countries, but they do not directly create the financial resources. See, financial resources are not being created. There is only exchange of finances between one entity and another entity. Nobody is creating financial resources here. The function of it will depend upon that there is sufficient demand of carbon credit, and which are obviously, as I said, are determined by political commitments, enforcement mechanism. There is a lot of uncertainty around all of this carbon credit market, and this we have seen again and again through over last many years, is the way we have see the carbon prices not going the way it should have. Just to give an example, today typical carbon prices kind of sits in Europe, is the most matured market around this thing. So I think if I am right, the current carbon prices sit somewhere between $60 to $80 per ton of carbon dioxide. But if you really look at the kind of impact that they are creating on the economy, if you really look at the only in terms of the impact, in terms of the floods, in terms of the change in environmental condition, change in resource planning, what all is happening around the world, if you just try to convert that into money, the actual money of this carbon would actually be much higher. And there were some reports which talks of these carbon prices between $100 to $150 easily, and some reports actually talked about more than $300 also. But overall what you can see is that while that is the kind of 1 ton of carbon should have the prices should have had, the actual prices which are trading is about $60 to $80. So that's kind of a thing which we need to kind of see that where are we headed. And so overall this what is happening is that this Article 6 mechanism are necessary for efficiency, but insufficient for mobilizing the scale of finance which is required for global decarbonization. What I'll leave you in this class, and maybe I'll catch up in the next class, is that on top of it, what is also happening is that the amount of money which is needed for this transition is much higher compared to the amount of money which is being put in the system right now. So while $100 billion was the money which developed nation was giving to developing nations, how much of money is actually being used by the world, or world is investing in all of this kind of carbon mitigation targets. And if you look at it, as per one of the reports, that is about $1.3 trillion per year, which is much lower than, just from the lowest estimate perspective also, this money should have been about $4 to $5 trillion per year. Some estimates also talk about that to be of the tune of about $8 trillion a year by 2030. And if that is the kind of money that we are talking about, the amount of money which is going in the market is much lower. So it is very clear that the financial mechanism which was created, that through NDCs, so what was thought through? What was thought through that there will be NDCs. Under NDCs, the emission targets will reduce. As emission targets reduces, the countries will need to do something to meet their targets, and to meet their targets, then they will either have to put in more money in mitigating those carbon which they're generating. And if they are not able to mitigate, they will be buying it from some other willing party who is willing to give their carbon credits to them, and in return they will be giving them the money to make them more resourceful. But and under that, a lot of money transition which was expected to kind of work around, and which will then in turn feed into the real technologies, is what was expected. But as you can see that the money has not kind of flown the way it was expected to flow. And there I will take you to my last lecture, is in terms of now you need to kind of work around and see that is that because the money is not available, or is that because there is a political willingness issue behind all this, which is leading to such a situation. I'll start my next lecture from this point itself, and then try to move towards that what could be the how is this whole structure looking like, and what are some of the tools which are looking as a popular tools in this whole transition. Thank you.